Hello, Psychology of Learning students. So we're in week 9, chapter 8. This is the second video, the last video covering chapter 8 in punishment. And at the end of this video, you'll have seen all of the videos that will be covered on exam 2. So remember, exam 2 will take place after spring break. So next week is spring break, and then the following week will be the exam, and it covers chapters 5, 6, 7, and 8. Okay, so let me call up the PowerPoint slides from where we left off last time. Here we go. All right. So in the first video that you've already watched, I introduced punishment, talked about positive and negative punishment, and I talked about the different variables that affect punishment, like contingency and contiguity and punisher intensity and the introductory level of the punishment. So in this video, I'm going to talk about 3 theories of punishment, some problems with punishment, and then 3 really great alternatives to punishment. So let's begin with the theories of punishment. So the first theory is called the disruption theory. And it basically says that behavior decreases because it can't be performed anymore when it's punished. So this would occur in a situation where the punishment introduces feelings that are incompatible with the behavior. One of Dr. Stern's favorite examples is if someone is laughing at you and then you embarrass them. If you embarrass them, it would be incompatible, not possible, for them to feel embarrassed and be laughing at you at the same time. They can't be in both of those states, laughing and embarrassed at the same time. So the punishment of embarrassing them prevents them from doing the behavior of laughing at you, because you can't laugh and be embarrassed at the same time. Now, while that might account for some of the punishment that goes on, there are lots of times where the behavior and the punishment can coexist. So disruption theory can't be the only thing that's going on. Then just like with reinforcement, we've got the one process theory that says that when punishment is going on, the only thing that's happening is operant conditioning. So the unwanted behavior decreases to escape the punishing consequences. The problem with the one process theory is that if one process theory is correct, then punishment and reinforcement should be, like Thorndike and Skinner thought, symmetrical. So as rewarding as reinforcement should be, is as negative as punishment should be, or I guess a better way to say it is, as much as behavior will increase with reinforcement is as much as behavior should decrease with punishment. But it doesn't seem to work that way. And so it seems as though really a two-process theory is a better account for the data. And this says that punishment involves both classical and operant conditioning. So for an example, if a rat presses a lever and gets a shock, well, the rat pressing the lever, getting the shock, then the rat should be less likely to press the lever because the shock is noxious, aversive. So that's purely operant conditioning. But in this example of happening, that lever is also getting paired with the shock as a conditioned stimulus. I mean, the shock, a normal response, if you think of the shock as a unconditioned stimulus, an unconditioned response to the shock is avoidance of it, right? So the lever, which was a conditioned stimulus, which was a neutral stimulus, is now a conditioned stimulus. The lever keeps getting paired with the shock. And so through classical conditioning, the animal should start to want to avoid the lever and even not get near the lever, much like the animal tries to stay away from the shock and not get near the shock. So you've got both classical conditioning and operant conditioning occurring. And so that's the two-process theory of punishment. Now let's talk about some problems with punishment. So I want you to know that punishment is effective. It's most effective when it's used properly and with enough strength, not too much and not too little. If it happens every single time that the behavior is given, and it's only given when the behavior is given, and it's given immediately after the behavior is given. So it's fast, then it produces rapid, substantial learning. It works. It doesn't work as well as reinforcement, but it works. It works. But there are some problems that occur with punishment that don't occur with reinforcement, especially if we're thinking about physical forms of positive punishment. So if we're thinking about spanking a child or having the child eat soap after they curse, different things like that. The problem with the physical forms of punishment is that behaviors sometimes will start getting emitted that lead the person to escape punishment, cheating, lying, making excuses. And that's not what we want. We want an honest child who also doesn't swear. Does that make sense? But to say, oh no, Mom, I didn't swear. You must have heard me wrong, because they're trying to get out of the spanking or the soap in the mouth. Another thing, especially with the spanking, is aggression. That oftentimes children that are spanked, they'll try to exert control over the punisher, over the person who's giving them the punisher. They'll get angry at the person who's punishing them, but they might displace their anger toward their doll or a pet. And they might have a hard time controlling their emotions, so it leads them to throw things. Also, sometimes after kids have some positive punishment, like a spanking or their mouths getting washed out with soap, things like that, they become apathetic. They stop doing any behaviors. It's like, I'm not going to do anything that might lead to this negative thing. So they get some apathy. So yes, they're learning not to swear, but they might be learning not to talk and start talking a lot less and withdrawing from being part of the family and part of the social situation. And sometimes when we spank, if the person who's delivering the punishment is angry and upset, then it can become more than a spanking, and it's actually abuse. And you can actually physically harm the child. That when you're trying to induce a punishment, sometimes it can go too far. And we all know the problems with abuse. Lastly, children that are spanked, they tend to start spanking themselves. So when they're frustrated on the playground, they're likely to hit or kick another child. Where less physical forms of punishment, or even not using punishment, relying more on reinforcement, tend to not lead to these aggressive behaviors on the playground and in other places where it's inappropriate. So what are some alternatives? We talked about how reinforcement is an alternative, but what are some other alternatives? So one that I want to talk about is response prevention. So you prevent the behavior from occurring in the first place. So if you're trying to get a child to stop biting their nails, if they wear gloves all the time, then you don't have to worry about it. They won't be able to bite their nails, so it's not a problem. Extinction. So think about when we talked about reinforcement in some of the last chapters, we talked about how you can extinguish a behavior by withholding all of the reinforcement for that. For this to be effective, though, you have to identify all of the reinforcers and get rid of all of them. And there's some problems with this. It's hard to do in the real world. And remember, we also, that extinction burst at the very, when you start to introduce extinction, sometimes the behavior increases for a little bit. And also the person can get really frustrated, like I think I should be getting this reinforcement and I'm not. So they start doing the behavior even more and they get frustrated and they might have an emotional outburst or something. And it's just hard to do. A lot of times it's not practical. So there are three different, what we call differential reinforcement procedures. And these three, really what they do is they combine non-reinforcement of the unwanted behavior with reinforcement of another behavior. So you're sort of combining extinction, that non-reinforcement of the unwanted behavior, with the reinforcement of another behavior. And there's three types that your book talks about that I'm going to go into. So the first one is DRA, differential reinforcement of alternative behaviors. The second one is DRI, differential reinforcement of incompatible behavior. And then DRL, differential reinforcement of low rate. So let's go to, we're going to go through each one of these. So with the differential reinforcement of alternative behavior, you're going to start offering reinforcement to the behavior, an alternate behavior that you want them to have. So if you want your child to no longer be on their phone at the dinner table, then one thing you can do is take the phone away. So when they're at the dinner table, they're not allowed to have their phone there. So that's sort of using response deprivation, right? I'm sorry, response prevention. But then you might reinforce them for initiating a table conversation at the table. You might, after dinner, reinforce them, say, oh, you know what, now would be a good time for you to call your friend. And so you reinforce them for calling their friend rather than texting on their friend. So you're reinforcing the alternative behaviors that you want instead of the behaviors that you're trying to reduce. So instead of being on the cell phone, you're going to talk to your family during dinner. You're going to talk on the phone to a friend rather than texting them. And you're going to reinforce those behaviors. So here's an example with a toddler who keeps throwing temper tantrums. Instead of just punishing the tantrum, you add reinforcements for whenever he uses his words. So when he's not throwing a tantrum, you're like, look at you, not look at how good you're being here, using your words to express how you're feeling. Okay. Okay, now a second one is the differential reinforcement of incompatible behavior. This one is great when you can come up with it. So the example that Dr. Stern came up with is if you're trying to reduce your eating of carbs. So you're trying to eat less carbs. One thing that you could do is to reinforce yourself for eating and filling up on vegetables and proteins. So you eat a whole bunch of fruits and a whole bunch of vegetables and a nice piece of fish that's cooked in a way that it just tastes fantastic. Well, now you have this wonderful feeling of feeling like you're not hungry anymore and you've eaten this great tasting food. Well, now that you're full, not only have you been reinforced for eating all these good, healthy foods that are not carbs, but because you're so full, you don't want to eat the bread. The thoughts of adding the carbs now, it's like you're too full to add the carbs. So you don't want it anymore. So you can see how that's an incompatible behavior now. You've made yourself so full on the vegetables and the fish and the fruits that you don't want the carb. Okay. Now, the last one that we're going to talk about, the differential reinforcement of low rate, is for when you don't want to totally get rid of the behavior. You just want to decrease its frequency. So maybe your child is exercising too much. Maybe they're having a problem with bulimia or anorexia, and they're just exercising so much. You don't want to get rid of exercising altogether. You just want to lower the rate of exercising. So here you might only reinforce your child after they've exercised for 30 minutes, but only if they stop exercising after the 30 minutes. So they exercise for 30 minutes, they get their reinforcement, and then they don't exercise anymore. And if they were to exercise more, then you take away that reinforcement or introduce the punishment. But the idea is that they're going to get reinforced for doing the behavior at the lower rate. So these are all alternatives to punishments and things that can be worked in with punishment that won't lead to some of the negative effects of spanking or washing the kid's mouth out with soap, things like that. Okay, and we have now finished chapter 8. Yep, no more slides. We have finished chapter 8 and we've finished all the material that will be on the second exam. If you have any questions, please email me at maryd@cameron.edu or marydz@cameron.edu. Okay.